we're back for season 2, and today there are 3 of us around the table, so let's go around. I'm obviously Liam Henderson.
Joanna's back from her holidays. And we have...
you have Deb Carson. Thank you for having me. Very exciting.
Isn't it?
Yes.
Who are you, Deb?
Who am I? Do you want me to say who I am? Well, I am Head of Operations for High Speed Rail Industry Leaders, which is an industry group that supports high speed rail. I wear a few hats actually because I work freelance. So I also am an associate for an organisation called Green Gauge 21, also doing rail research more widely than just high speed. And I've got my other hat on, I suppose, which is from local government, where I had a previous life and career for the Local Government Association and lots of other councils and public sector organisations doing work on equality and cohesion and inclusion. So this podcast is very interesting to me.
Topic for today.
Yes.
So just as an aside point, is that we have previously worked together for Rail Innovation Group events.
Yes.
So we may be referencing some events, so people know that we already know each other.
Yes, we do. We know each other.
Had lots of cake.
Yeah.
Oh! Johanna finally made me cake last week.
I know.
Macaroons.
And it's funny, before we go on, I was going to bring cake today, but then they have a policy of only eating food so we're at the Royal Society of Arts today, and they have a policy of, because they are a charity and they rely on
I'm just going to casually cover up my banana skin at this point because I didn't know that.
they rely on the money they make from the food. They don't like you to bring stuff in, so I didn't. So I didn't bring anything in. But we are very much on the line. But I have been thinking though, if innovation was a cake, what type of cake would it be? Just to randomly go off on another subject for a few
Marmalade
minutes.
and marrow.
Why marmalade and marrow?
It makes people uncomfortable and shiver.
That was a really bad joke, and I think you need to think about it more seriously. Because cake is very serious and shouldn't be joked about.
No, exactly. An innovative cake, I don't know. I saw a few on Bake Off last night that would have looked pretty.
Baked Alaska that shouldn't work, but does.
Yeah, amazing.
So I've been thinking about designing a cake for our group.
Okay.
So I've been thinking about it, but I haven't thought about what type of cake it should be yet.
My expectations are very high already.
Because I have made new types of cakes, but they usually involve alcohol, so I don't think that would be very good for rail. So
no, perhaps have to be alcohol free for rail.
We'll see. A work
Interesting,
one and a post-work one.
Yes, we'll have to give that some serious thought.
Right. Down to
okay,
business.
down to business. Yes. Right. Okay. So we are sat in the library of the RSA in central London, and we're going to be talking today about inequality in transport, which was a subject that Deb chose. So before we sort of get into it, why did you choose this subject?
Well, I chose it for 2 reasons really. One is because I find it interesting that there is such a strong connection between transport and inequality, equality, whichever way around you want to have it. And for me that's interesting because, as I said before, I used to work in local government on equality and inclusion policy, and have sort of moved into rail in the last, 8 or 9 years I suppose. I've worked in rail, so I'm a real newbie to rail because obviously most people have been in rail their whole lives, and so it's interesting for me that my 2 worlds are kind of colliding in that sense, and it's not something that's particularly obvious when you first think about how transport might be able to counter some of the inequalities that we have in society. Actually, when you start to look at it, you realise that it's a sort of critical component really to a more sustainable and equal society. So I think it's a really interesting topic. I mean, we could probably only touch on certain bits of it today because there's so much to it, but hopefully it might pique people's interest to go away and
I think it is. I mean, I think, as you said, it is a wide subject and it's really interesting because I am going to call myself a girly swat because girly squats are trending at the moment, so I think I'm going to take that title up. But I did a lot of research and reading into this, and I've never really thought about it before, about how how big the subject is, because when we think of inequality, we tend to think of, disability groups, because we talk about that, but the subject is so much wider than that. And I found myself getting really angry, at the way transport does impact, or public transport, actually it's all transport, isn't it, on people's ability to be able to access work, education, leisure facilities, shopping, hospital, all sorts of things, and how that does your ability to not just access it, but to have opportunity.
And there's lots and lots of evidence to show that it has, it's a critical component really in whether areas are, economically active or inactive, and whether they're kind of moving up the social mobility scale, or whatever scale you care to look at. So it's a huge thing. I mean, I think for the purposes of this, in my head, I'd kind of set aside the whole kind of the disability and that kind of side of inequality, just because, I mean, let's face it, we all appreciate that, for example, train operators, anyone you care to mention, have still got quite a long way to go to be able to make their services completely inclusive for people that have got any kind of impairment. So that's kind of that's almost an easier thing to kind of, get your head around, really, isn't it? The fact that,
and I think in the research, because one of the things that comes up a lot is less about rail travel, because rail travel, there's a lot of places in the country that don't have access to rail, so they're dependent on either the car or a bus, and particularly low income groups, and that was really what was making me angry, because both of those policy areas, particularly in the last 10 years, have really impacted on those groups of people. And I mean, I think if you're looking at inequality in terms of social mobility and economic inequality, which is obviously a big driver with the government looking at productivity and all that kind of thing, there are that kind of notion of having a completely integrated transport system, I think, is where you kind of have to start, because you have to, it has to cover all modes of transport, to be able to, for people to be able to use transport effectively, to move themselves into places where they have more opportunities, or where they can go become more, have more skills, all that kind of thing. It's reliant on a completely integrated transport system. And that's something that, in this, I mean, we don't even have a proper transport strategy in this country, which is, to me, shocking, actually. Well, you're right.
There's many different government departments looking at inequality and, trying to improve particular, certain areas that have gone into industrial decline and all that kind of thing, and productivity. And to me, transport's the biggest thing in that argument, and yet we don't have a national transport strategy.
But I think that was one of the things that was striking me in my research, was that it's just across everything a complete lack of integrated policy. It's not even just a lack of transport policy. There was no correlation between, I've always said, about, one of the reasons why, if you only have to look at the National Transport Survey, Travel Survey, that the Department for Transport has carried out every year, since 1967 or something, and that's showing that we're not travelling less, we're not necessarily doing any more journeys, but what we're doing is we're travelling further distances, and that's obviously related to housing. And the fact that people can't live in, people who earn median incomes or are on lower incomes cannot live in city centres. And this was also something that was coming up in a trend worldwide as well, is that what you're getting is, with gentrification, that you're getting rich enclaves in the city centres as they become more gentrified again, and then the poor and the middle classes are living in the suburbs. And as a result of that, anything you do with transport policy is actually, the burden is being put on the lower income earners. So if you put the cost of fuel up, because you're reliant on your car, because you don't necessarily have the access to the public transport. That is, affecting you disproportionately. The cost of rail fares is affecting you disproportionately. But then, but that's just housing. But they sort of like they're saying that 10% of all hospital appointments are missed because people can't get to the hospital because they don't have access to public transport. And where's the research into that? Because surely for the cost of a bus service.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Green Gauge actually have done a really interesting piece of work on interurban buses, which if anyone wants to have a look and access that, they can on the Green Gauge 21 website, because it's a really key piece of the jigsaw in terms of proper integrated transport is the bus services. And it's tricky, isn't it? The model, I think, that is kind of applied to when you are looking at transport improvements is also not particularly fit for purpose. There's tea pouring noise there, because actually when it relies on the transport strategy relies on passenger growth to bring new services in, but actually in a lot of areas where there is high unemployment or particularly low wages, you're not going to have that passenger growth to be able to apply the formula to be able to improve the transport links. So it needs
business cases.
So the business case isn't there.
Our very first episode was on the fact that you need a business case for everything.
Yeah. And it's the way that you build the business case is the issue, isn't it? Because if you're looking at if you are bringing in other pieces of the jigsaw around the kind of whole inequality story, if you're looking at other factors like health inequality, all those kind of things that are extremely costly actually to the national economy, then if you built a better model around picking up some of that stuff, then actually I would suggest that you would be able to build a business case for that kind of thing. But it's just that we're looking in the wrong places, aren't we? I think.
So we're trying to move to a system that has societal benefits in appraisals.
Well, I think obviously, within transport policy, a lot of transport improvements are measured in terms of the government handbook under WebTag and the passenger demand handbook and all the rest of it. But there has been movements to try and measure some of the social benefits and to move more onto benefit frameworks. Have you done any work on that so that you can measure more of those intangible benefits?
Yeah, I haven't personally done any work on that. I mean, there has been lots of work done on that, and Green Gauge have done quite a lot of work on that, but not that something that I've been particularly involved with. But KPMG have done work that looks at kind of how connectivity. I think the last report that they did, the study showed that a 10% they use the index of multiple deprivation, I think, in a lot of their studies. But that, I think they found that a 10% improvement in connectivity gave a 3.6% improvement in economic, social and environmental deprivations figures, which is quite impressive actually if you think about that. And it's something that I don't know whether in your research you looked at the UK 2070 Commission. They've been that commission was set up, I can't remember when, but it's just reported its second set of findings, and again Green Gauge has done some work to kind of support some of that policy area, but they talk about requiring a connectivity revolution to counter some of the massive regional inequalities across the country.
On that, what is your feeling? So obviously in the press today at the moment it's all about the coastal communities, deprivation in coastal communities, lots of which have train stations near the end of the line. Mm-hmm. So in that respect, with regard to transport inequality, are we trying to pull economic growth to these extremely isolated regional places, or are we trying to improve people's access from those places to the places where there's existing economy?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think you would probably say to some extent both. I mean, if you're trying to build a better local economy, then obviously you want people to be able to for example, when you're looking at people going to seek out training, for example, and if you look at the evidence tells you that a lot of people will go to cities or be sent into cities, like apprentices will go to cities because it's easier to get from one place to another. You know, that they'll go to where the easiest transport link is. So actually that's to the detriment of the local area where they could be training providers, you know, that are just not particularly accessible. And I suppose if you sort of take that thought and that model and apply that across any number of areas, then you are then, if you're constantly encouraging people out of your area to access all of that, then you're not building your own local base for anything, whether it's productivity, economic growth or anything else.
And it's kind of like, and just taking that a step further is, when we were exploring earlier about lack of integration, is that the feeling I got in the research, because of this urbanisation and because you are pulling things into centres, I think actually that's what's affecting our high streets, because local small towns, they're not getting the people during the week because people are being pulled into urban centres to support a local economy. And so it kind of it's almost like a vicious circle that we're creating unsustainable towns, where people are being drawn in, we're travelling longer distances, we're getting there faster by train or by car, and we're not actually sustaining our local economies, and we're creating huge dormitory towns all over the place. And that has implications for services, it has implications for businesses, and so only big cities or big towns can sustain in the future.
So to cover off the obvious elephant inside of the room, is that we all have experience of HS2, which is building a rail line from the middle of a big city to another big city, focusing everything in the big city. How are we comfortable with that reinforcing what you just said? Does it, or what's it doing to?
Well, I think it's part of a bigger picture, isn't it? Or it should be. For me, the important thing, and something that does concern me, is that if you're talking about kind of, government strategy and how government approaches this kind of thing, is that it's part of that. HS2 is a critical part of the carbon narrative that we've just signed up to net zero by 2050. I think obviously HS2 is a huge part of that. It's also a big part of the bigger sort of moving away from the sort of everything emanating from London, actually, to try and shift all of that transport development up into the Midlands and the North is a really important bit of trying to get that much more inclusive connectivity. It's not the end of the story. It's not in itself going to make that happen. And what's worrying is that if you're nitpicking away at it, sorry, I'm going to mention the Oakley review, that's why I think it's so important to have, for example, why was the National Infrastructure Commission set up? It was set up to take a big picture view of what infrastructure is important in the UK
and take the politics out
of it, because actually, these are things that are crucial. Broadband speed, transport. They're the key. Housing and planning. They're key things that really need to be thought about in a completely integrated way, and it all has such an impact on whether we actually try and build a less unequal society and actually have a more balanced economy right across the country is critical.
I think
I'm sounding like a politician without meaning that.
I think you're right. It is vital to the economic growth, particularly for the Midlands and north of Manchester and beyond, because it will have. Although people say it's going to benefit London more and all the rest of it, I don't think it will. I think it will drive business out of London, because you can already see the evidence of that happening in Birmingham, for example, where businesses are already starting to move to Birmingham. But also I think that part of the problem with HS2, and I don't want to make this about HS2, is that because the publicity on HS2 ever since it was conceived has been defensive, that actually they feel as they've had to sell a story on capacity, but actually given the carbon requirement, actually High Speed 2 has the opportunity to do what High Speed Rail has done in France and in Japan, and take airplanes out of the sky. And that's really what it should be focusing in on taking domestic travel away from Heathrow. And I know that won't be popular for a lot of people, but HS2 will be able to link Heathrow, Birmingham Airport and Manchester Airport, and that is one of the London-Manchester corridor of people interchanging once they arrive into the UK from all over the world is one of the biggest flights. So actually, if you re-examine it, you might not actually need the third runway at Heathrow if you focus on the speed of HS2. And that is good. That's got to be good for the climate, hasn't it? And that's got to be good for the economy of the UK, because actually that is, people flying and interchanging at Heathrow doesn't do much to benefit the UK economy, whereas High Speed 2 and people interchanging into a domestic rail service will do a lot for the economy of the UK.
And also the Scottish narrative around that, which is that they want to be able to get to Scotland in less than 3 hours, which again is comparable with a domestic flight. So
and that should be the story. It should be it should be competing with air.
And also it's not just the narrative for carbon around aviation, but also the stations for HS2 are being right in cities, which actually, as you say, is a you can look at that either way, but in terms of carbon, that means that you're not changing your transport, you're not changing onto different modes of transport, you're going right into the city in one journey. So
as long as transport to those stations is
this is where the integrated transport comes in, and it's absolutely that's such a critical part thing, and in some areas, I mean, in the Green Gauge report that I mentioned earlier, the work that they've done to support the UK 2070 Commission, they've picked out, we've picked out some very specific and quite easy wins around, changing, bus routes and stuff like that to actually improve connectivity, and that's way beyond what you would
and that actually is about interdependency of the policies again, isn't it, and collaborating together to ensure that we get the benefits, because it's one of the other bits of research that I looked into when we had this topic was about active transport, and I think it's interesting, this term active transport, it actually means walking and cycling, and I think we should be, and scooting or whatever, and shared mobility and all the rest of it, and we should be in terms of breaking down some of those barriers of inequality, we should be looking more at that, because linking back to the health again, because we tend to design everything around the car, particularly in city centres and things, and not actually designing it for the cyclist, the pedestrian and that, we're actually creating more inequalities because we're making people's health worse, and that's all linked to the carbon and everything, and if we're really serious about this, some of these challenges that we have, we can actually turn them around by thinking about these policies better.
All that kind of smart transport planning is so important, isn't it? Because on the one hand, everyone's kind of being told they need to get fitter and do this, that and the other, but actually a lot of places are designed so poorly that you can't walk comfortably from one place to another, when actually you could do the distance, but you just couldn't do. You can't get to where you.
I think. But I think this was the thing, was that one of the things that I picked up, one of the statistics I picked up was that roads transport are responsible for 26% of UK greenhouse gases, and since when was the climate change? When was Kyoto?
1998 or something like that.
Right, it has not changed. So in terms of transport, we have made no changes at all, even with technology changing that, because and I think I saw a piece in the news about because it was in Germany, about how they're thinking of banning SUVs, aren't they?
Yes.
Because of the fact that so people aren't driving small cars anymore, but what is any benefits that you've got from the innovation in the improved engines and that you've just made up for by having bigger engines. So they're thinking about banning them in order to
Germany and countries now just approved a giant open cast mine to reopen its
I know, it's bonkers, isn't it? But I think what of course was that because of all this, when sort of like we're talking about the inequalities and that, because you've got transport dependency and transport poverty and that and reliance on cars and not necessarily being able to actively walk, was that people that live near roads, they're more likely to die younger, they're more likely to have worse pregnancy outcomes, more likely to have asthma in children. And we've seen stuff in the news about schools.
That's been really that's been a key part of why the mayor has taken the decisions that he has done on car use, isn't it? Is because of those instances of asthma in particular boroughs.
I think, and I sort of like another statistic that I picked up was that Royal College of Physicians have assessed that there are 40,000 premature deaths a year because of the way we design our roads and that we haven't made any inroads into our transport policy, and that it also leads to obesity. Because we're not designing environments where people can walk and cycle. So this is becoming a barrier to active travel and causing sedentary behaviours.
So it's leading to sort of health inequalities, shorter life expectancy and all that kind of stuff. It's not something you'd automatically think of when you think of transport, is it? But it's quite incredible actually, some of those statistics.
And although I've picked this stuff up because this has all come out of a government report that was done not by the Department for Transport but by the Chief Scientific Officer, and it was published this year. So a lot of this information's come out there, was that they've said urgent action is needed to understand how we address this. And I think I'm not going to mention the other elephant in the room, but that's part of the problem at the moment, isn't it? That nothing else is happening in government.
No.
Because of the wider political situation. So how do we
except generally emissions go down when there's a recession because there's economic activity.
Yippee!
So that's one of the things.
So when
more infrastructure being built.
So when we've all returned to 1920s poverty,
yes, exactly, we'll be fine. We can all just walk on it in our shoes that are all worn out because we can't afford anymore. I can't wait.
And so kind of we've got kind of just nothing's happening. We've got this blockage. So I kind of, before we move on to what are the opportunities now, I kind of just want to touch specifically on a bit on sort of like austerity and buses, because I think that has been a big problem.
Yeah, it has been.
In terms of how services have cut back. And I live in a town now which more people catch buses than anywhere else in the UK, and that's Brighton. We have bus congestion. We have so many buses, in Brighton, and then they're always. But is it regulated? Is it still regulated in Brighton? It's run by the big operator is Go Ahead, and then there's also some services by Stagecoach as well that do the longer distance type ones. But
I think a lot of the issues around, it's a big issue in everything that we've talked about as well, is the kind of is ticketing and pricing and concessions and that kind of thing. Because that's a really important element of if you're trying to encourage people back into back into work, back into training and having to use transport, then there needs to be concessions.
Where rural bus services exist, they're really expensive as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Well, I think cost is a really big challenge, isn't it?
I live in Kent. Buses are expensive in Kent. Everybody complains about traffic congestion, but I believe it's still true that children don't get half fare.
No, and I read something about that because
they pay full fare because they're travelling in commuter time, which to me is utterly ludicrous.
Because and this is, I mean, because I kind of thought, where does the Equality Act sit in all of this? And because I did read about, because concessionary fares for older people, shall we say retired, set in legislation, aren't they? Although I didn't realise until recently that they'd secretly linked it to the latest retirement age for women, which is now 67.
Yeah.
So when we moved to Brighton, my husband thought he was going to get a bus pass. No, you've got to wait another 7 years, sir.
But in London, it's 60.
Yeah. So is that? So is that discriminatory because different authorities are applying policy different?
Yeah. No, I don't. No, not under the law, but it's interesting.
But under the Equality Act.
Under the Equality Act.
Because my husband's not working; he is retired.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't think that applies, but. What I do think is that, which is something that the UK 2070 Commission has also talked about quite a lot when we're talking about inequality and tackling all of this, is that devolution. Because obviously devolution will have a big, should have a big impact. I mean, if you look at London, has a much fairer and easily accessible and streamlined way of doing things in terms of ticketing and transport generally. So I think
it's regulated.
And because it's devolved,
and you have an authority, don't you?
Yeah. So I mean, that's that will hopefully, as transport for Greater Manchester and transport for the north and all the rest of it start to kind of.
But that reinforces the city thing.
It does reinforce the city thing.
It does. I mean, I'm talking about in terms of money. I'm talking about that if
you mean government grant.
If you're looking at funding,
but this was the other thing that I was thinking, because any concessionary fares for younger people, whether it's underage or whether it's student, whatever, is purely discretionary according to what is available in local authorities. And of course, we've had something called austerity, although allegedly that is now finished. But allegedly
soon to be reintroduced.
But
small breather.
But then I read an article which was from the Guardian, I think it was. Was it from the Guardian?
Other news.
No, it was from the Independent. I did look at the Guardian and the Independent because there was a couple of stories, and this was a report about from the London from the Transport Select Committee, chaired by Lillian Greenwood MP, and they were investigating about the reduction in public transport journeys in general and the bus cuts, and in the evidence that was given. 85 million journeys have been cut from buses in the last 10 years, so that's 2% of all bus services have been cut. And the local government association said that half of all bus services are at risk of being scrapped due to lack of funding, and that councils were being forced to fill the gaps because of this lack of funding, and there was currently a deficit for concessionary fares, and these are the ones that they legally have to provide, of 652 million.
Wow.
Now, when you think, how many councils have gone bankrupt now, or in special measures? Three, is it?
I think at last count.
So you've got Northampton, Sussex, or East Sussex that have gone.
East Sussex, I think, and can't remember the other one. But yes. And there's a whole chunk of councils that are
at risk. Yes.
Absolutely.
And they've got pressures with social services. They've got pressures with education. And
transport's not.
And I guess in some ways, my question is, does austerity have to last, or actually, do we? If we want these benefits, do we just have to accept, and we need to be able to provide these things? We just need to pay more tax.
Well, there's a question.
Which would you prefer? Pay more tax but have cheaper transport services overall for everybody that would benefit everybody?
Well,
if you had a choice of, sort of, let's say 2% more tax a year, but your train fares, for example, were going to come down by half.
What was the alternative?
The alternative to what?
You're saying either or. What's the or?
well, that was it, or we just carry on the way we are, where we just keep where we keep just cutting services, we keep cutting our infrastructure, we keep putting train fares up, because train fares have gone up 20% in real terms since privatisation. Is that good for getting people to work, for running our economy? Is that a good policy?
We are taking us down a very dangerous road, back into heavy politics here, Johannah. I mean, I don't want to, call my hand out right now. I could be accused of being a rampant socialist if I tell you what I really think. But I think that what I do think is that there has to, if you're going to rebalance the economy, and the government talks about rebalancing the economy such a lot, but there's no what's the action backing that up. And I think everything that we've talked about on today has been to say that actually there has to be an integrated transport system in this country to back up this rebalancing
and that supports our economy
and
what we need to deliver.
And if you look at all of the areas that we've talked about, the coastal areas, rural areas, I mean, we are all in a bubble in the southeast, aren't we? Let's face it, all three of us live in the southeast, so we all experience very good transport infrastructure in the main. I mean, obviously I get on HS1, which is a premium service, so it's an expensive service but an excellent service. So there's lots of things that you can, that's a difficult conversation to have around fares at the moment, isn't it? Because obviously it is all privatised. But I think that if you look at these areas that are outside of that bubble, coastal areas, areas up in the Midlands and parts of the north where there are, really, really significant issues around unemployment, then transport has to be in the picture there when you're talking about how to bring some of those areas up in terms of productivity
and I think that's I think that is really important. And you're right about the southeast bubble. Completely. Because twice in my life I've moved, and in both those times I've moved from those types of regions back into the southeast. So I grew up in Great Yarmouth, which is one of the, I think if you look at the Department for Transport map on most deprived transport areas in the country, Great Yarmouth is there in bright red.
Yeah, but it'll also be on the deprived in other aspects.
I've not lived there for 30 years. And the reason I moved was because the transport's bad. There's no jobs unless you work in the tourism. And there was a lot more work there when I lived there. So you had, Norfolk Line were there, all the big shipping companies were there, and I don't think any of that is there anymore. So it's got worse, and also the transport service has got worse, because when I lived there used to be a direct intercity service there as well, and that's not been there for 25 years. But
that's the trouble, isn't it? What we talked about earlier about that, demand versus how to re-look at making that business case, isn't it? And
then I've just moved from the Midlands, so I lived in Oakham, one of those towns I'm saying has been created into a dormitory town. I think the high street is now full of charity shops and coffee shops, because that's all that can be sustained now. Whilst I lived there, the whole time I was there, I was campaigning for a half-hourly train service. The business case does stack up, but because of lack of franchising that's been going on the cross-country franchise, and lack of rolling stock and all stuff to do with electrification, it hasn't happened, even though it has been in the franchise agreement for 12 years to deliver a half-hourly service. And just on going back to the bus point, was that because I was quite heavily involved in the local politics there, is that last year the bus company withdrew a bus service from one of the local villages, and it doesn't have a train service. People relied on this to go to work. People were relying on this bus service to get to work, so the council had to step in to subsidise it. But one of the things that when I was looking at it is that this place, Wissendine, is 23 miles from Leicester. And that's where people are going for hospital appointments, for education, and that it takes you 40 minutes to drive it. If you want to go by public transport, depending on the time of day you travel, it can take you anything between an hour and 15 minutes and 2.5 hours.
Which is ridiculous.
Because there is no
going to do that.
Because there's no direct bus service now anymore. The bus service takes you to Oakham. The bus service doesn't connect into the train. And so, if you've got a hospital appointment or something, which is where you'd go to Leicester Hospital, but how are you supposed to get to hospital for healthcare or whatever? I don't know.
Another bit of the public sector has to fill the gap. Send somebody else
Yes,
to get you.
and that's what it is. It's just sort of like pushing paper dollars all over the place, isn't it?
But if we want to finish on a bit more of a positive note, looking at a service like High Speed 1, which is obviously the first high-speed line that was built in the UK, just celebrating its 10-year anniversary. That service has had a massively productive impact on all of those coastal towns down in the southeast. All of those towns, Margate, Ramsgate, Broadstairs, Faversham, Ashford, all those towns that were actually quite, particularly Margate, very suffering from the usual decline that those kind of Victorian seaside towns have suffered over decades. High unemployment, not much work around. Lots of those areas are where, frankly, local authorities dump off people like looked after children because they don't want to house them in their own boroughs. So they've got a whole plethora of issues in those areas, and they're all stemming from, basically social inequality. And that line has had a big impact on improving the local economy in all of those areas. So that is a real kind of, you can really evidence that. When you look at.
So the evidence is there that transport can have a positive impact.
And also it's had a massively positive impact actually on their tourism narratives, all of those towns, which was, I think, quite unexpected. But they did bring out a report, I think, last year, which showed that they'd had a phenomenal increase in their tourism numbers in all of those towns.
Yeah, I've been there for days.
And that's because you can get there very quickly and very, those trains are fast and reliable and nice, nice, pleasant.
Do you think High Speed 1 has been more successful than people predicted?
Absolutely.
And do you think
like 11% on year growth?
And do you think the people who lived in these towns thought that they would benefit from that?
No, and I don't think they did completely. And I think it's interesting when you hear at the moment all the kind of very negative narrative around HS2 and knocking down, ancient woodland and all of the negative stuff that's being put out in the media at the moment, very disappointingly from environmental groups, which I find extraordinary. I have to say that all these quite significant environmental groups are coming out against a public transport system. But there you are. Sorry I'm saying that. But
I find it weird as well.
But equally on HS1, I remember, because I live in the area, so I do remember there was a lot of ancient woodland that had to be removed to build HS1. There were the usual mitigations, replanting, all that sort of thing. Everybody moaned about it until it was all open, and then everyone just said, "Oh, isn't this a lovely transport system that we've now got in Kent? Don't we all just love it?" So I'm hoping that the same will happen for HS2, because I think people are very kind of. The trouble is people don't get into the detail, and actually we haven't got a problem with ancient woodland in this country, so there's plenty of it, and you can chop it down and start again. It's not the end of the world. There are bigger picture things here, I think. So everyone's very happy with HS1 in Kent.
I know, I think there's a great picture from High Speed 1 where the cut and cover was done, and it's like, here's what it looked like before, here's what it looked like in construction, here it is now, spot the difference.
yeah, exactly. It's fantastic. They did some brilliant sound mitigation, all that sort of thing. And I mean, obviously that, because of all of that technology is developing at a rate of knots, I would imagine that HS2 will be several steps ahead of that this time around. So it's a really, really positive story from HS1, and I hope that HS2 we end up talking about that in 20 years and saying how marvellous it is.
So we're going to finish on a positive note. So good news story, High Speed 1, transport can make a difference. And I was going to say one positive thing from everybody, but do you want to say something else before we say one positive thing from everybody?
You started off with a local authority policy role, now you're in more of like a delivery industry. Would you recommend that as for people to help make a difference, or should they stay in policy?
I don't know. I think what's important is for people to dip in and out of other areas, and I think it's interesting that we talk a lot. Obviously, I work a lot on HS2 related, work, and one of the things we talk about a lot is how to bring innovation into the supply chain. And
a thing or two about that.
Yes, we do. It's a quick plug for our startup early events. But one of the things that I think all of the suppliers into HS2 at the moment are looking at is how to get people from different industries to come into rail, because that's when you get that cross sectoral learning, or whatever you call it. That's when you get people having different ideas about doing things. I don't know how you sort out government to do that, because I have to say that's what they need to do. They need to stop working in their departmental silos and get out and speak to other colleagues in other departments. I appreciate they do that, but if we're going to have a properly integrated transport system in this country, that's what needs to happen. Is the government departments need to talk to each other.
Great, thanks.
So I was going to sort of from everybody ask, what would be the one thing that you think could really improve transport inequality that we could solve on a looking at the opportunities?
For me, it would be just giving all young people free travel.
And what age is that sort of school age, if you're in full-time education?
Full-time education, I think. Yeah. Controversial, I know.
I don't think it is, because I had
they do it in London.
Well, they do it in London, but I think up until I went to university, I always had free travel. Not on trains, but on buses. I used to get it from my college every term, like this little card or something. I might have paid £10 a term for it, but it was.
Yeah, I think we did as well. Yeah.
I would say public sector buses.
Yeah. What, taking them back into public sector ownership?
Or filling the country full of more buses, basically.
More buses.
More bus services.
Because there was a picture. I saw a picture today where it showed sort of did you see it on? I think it might have been on LinkedIn. I think it might have come out of the European Transport Commission or something, where they showed sort of how many people from 77 cars or something can fit onto a bus, and it's like 2 buses. Yeah, and how much better the streets are, because I have to say, coming up Whitehall today, the one thing you can say about the Extinction Rebellion protest, it was lovely walking through Parliament Square and up Whitehall, because there's no traffic, because they've blocked all the roads off.
Yes.
You're just walking up and down, and it's lovely. It always feels like a party. So thank you, Extinction Rebellion. I'm going to follow on with designing streets for people. Actually starting from an individual level, and then thinking about how we need to how our transport needs need to be met, because they don't always need to be about the car, and we should be designing streetscapes for more active transport, so that we can walk and we can cycle better on our streets, and also so that they're actually designed for public transport and integrated in with rail hubs.
Yeah.
So that we're creating communities.
That's a good one. We'll let that one in.
It's like room 101, isn't it? Except we're bringing them in rather than putting them in a room.
Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a very interesting conversation.